My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Throughout Cartoon Network video game history, we saw that developers were rarely allowed to work on a particular franchise more than once, meaning genuine sequels were a rare thing. While the name might not immediately make it obvious, Rugrats Studio Tour is so clearly a sequel and evolution of what developer Nspace created with Search For Reptar. Released on November 10, 1999 exclusively for the PlayStation yet again, Studio Tour had mighty big shoes to fill. Nspace successfully pulled off the very first Nickelodeon 3D console game. Search For Reptar wasn't some staggeringly incredible game that everybody should rush out and play, but it was a serviceable game that was filled with care for the Rugrats franchise. Studio Tour was literally Nspace's very next game after Search For Reptar, utilising many of the same assets and the same game engine. While there might not be some sort of grand overarching narrative or two at the end of the title, it's clear that we've got a proper sequel to Search For Reptar. Rugrats was a certified juggernaut at this point, dominating in both the TV and movie spaces. The same thing was starting to happen with the video game industry too. Search For Reptar sold so well that it was incorporated into PlayStation's Greatest Hits collection, but for Studio Tour they'd go even further to leverage the Rugrats brand recognition. According to an IGN article from way back in 1999, PlayStation featured this game on the back of PlayStation boxes for that year's Christmas period. It's impossible to overstate how big of a deal Rugrats was at this time. Bizarrely though, Studio Tour is one of the few Nickelodeon games I haven't been able to dig up an aggregate review score for. It's damn near impossible to find any written reviews for this game from back in 1999. This seems crazy to me when you consider the immense popularity of Rugrats, combined with it being a seemingly very high profile release. Rugrats Studio Tour is a game I spent countless hours playing as a kid though, so I have some sort of idea about what to expect heading into this. Could it possibly live up to the memories I have of it? Before I get stuck into Studio Tour, I think it's important that I let you all know that my gameplay capture for the first two worlds of this game completely stuffed up. Everything's normal after that, but if you notice that the gameplay you see on screen isn't perfectly representing some of the points I'm making, then that's why. The premise for Rugrats Studio Tour is just that. The Rugrats crew have been taken on a backstage tour of Gigantamungous Studios. God, I hope this tour isn't hosted by Jimmy Fallon like the last Studio Tour I went on.
Oh, hey there! You made it! Welcome to the Universal Studio Tour. I'm Jimmy Fallon. I'll be making sure that you get through this experience in one piece.
Because this is Rugrats, the babies decided to throw caution to the wind and run off from the grown-ups to have their own adventure. The whole premise here just naturally feels like a Rugrats episode. The babies getting lost on a backstage studio tour pretty much writes itself. So the kids sneak onto some of the sets, but are quickly discovered by security. Dill then proceeds to steal a set of keys and yeet them before locking himself behind the door that said keys open. To save Tommy's asshole brother, it's up to the babies to track down all of the keys. The opening cutscene, and all of the others throughout the game, are top notch just like Search For Reptar. The voice work and visuals are great, and are yet again a treat for fans of the show. How do we go about finding the keys though? By playing through various mini-games of course. Studio Tour is split up into 5 different attractions, each of which has a different theme. Each of the game's worlds are kind of presented as a sort of attraction where you can pretend to star in a movie. However, this gets a little murky, because at times it genuinely feels like they're using these babies to shoot proper movies.
Well, get ready. You're going where no baby has gone before. Outside space! And I'm gonna be sent to the moon if I don't finish this scene.
I think this might be one of those times where it's supposed to be the baby's imaginations, but this guy who greets you every time you head into a newly themed world really muddies the water with his dialogue. Once you've chosen which movie set to head to, you're given free rein to run around and pick one of several minigames. As I usually do, I decided to just go in the order the game presents things in. So first up was Captain Cookie's, which was Angelica's world. As you can see, it's pirate themed, which results in many of the minigames following the theme. My immediate reaction once getting control of the game was that movement feels super fluid. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the way Search For Reptar handled, but here it's just buttery smooth and makes for a very pleasant gameplay experience. And that movement was certainly needed because the very first minigame I played was a foot race. Here you have to race against the other babies in what can only be described as Mario Kart on foot. It's complete with power-ups and speed boosts and everything. There's something kind of quaint about this take on kart racing. Unfortunately though, this is a super frustrating experience. Overtaking other players is a huge pain in the ass, and in general, these races are so static. Everybody just goes the same speed unless they go over one of the few boost pads or get the one item that gives you a very brief speed boost. Without either of those, you're just plodding along at identical paces, unless you somehow manage to run into the hazards that barely exist. It means that if you stuff up out of the gates, catching up to whoever's in first can be a nightmare. The AI seem to never make mistakes on their own accord, and you really don't have any useful offensive items to reel them back in. It's just a frustrating experience that isn't any fun, despite seeming cool on the surface. For my hard work, I want a key for the door Dill is locked behind. I need 8 of these to progress. You don't have to just plow through 8 minigames to achieve that though. Just like Search For Reptar, there's an alternative way of earning keys. You'll probably have noticed by now that there are these Reptar tokens dotted around levels. Collecting 50 of these grants you an extra key, making life a lot easier. Next up in Angelica's world was Tag. Yeah, it does what it says on the tin. Using the map from the foot race, it's your job to run around and tag all the babies before the time limit is up. This game gives you a mini-map for this, so it's unbelievably easy to complete. Not that it would have been too hard without it. So after that very brief pit stop, it was onto something familiar to Search For Reptar players. Mini golf returns, but in a much larger way. Search For Reptar featured one 9-hole course, but Studio Tour ups the ante. Not only are courses much more complex, but you'll also be playing mini golf again when you get to Susie's world. You're tasked with making par or being under for the whole course, whereas I believe Search For Reptar required you to just make par on each individual hole. This means you have the chance to stuff up on one hole, but make it up by being really good on the others. I actually quite enjoyed this little quirk. I messed up the first hole on Angelica's course, which made the rest of the 8 holes pretty tense as I tried to claw my way back. One thing that was a little frustrating was just how long this game goes for. 9 holes takes an eternity, especially compared to how fast all of the other mini games are here. Not to mention, if you lose, you have to start all over again. I would have just about considered rage quitting if that had have happened to me. Next up was Treasure Hunt. No prizes for guessing what the objective of this one is. Here you get placed in a location and you're tasked with finding 4 treasure chests, which contain keys, before unlocking a bigger treasure chest, all while dodging enemies and doing some light platforming. Some major frustrations really started to set in here, mostly stemming from the camera. If an enemy hits you, you'll lose a key, which is sent back to one of the chests you grabbed it from. Having to backtrack from an enemy hit is frustrating, but that's mostly because of how you end up taking damage. So many times I was blindsided by an enemy who was coming around a corner with no way for me to see them. This is mostly because you have absolutely no control over the camera. Well, that's technically not true. Like Search For Reptar, you've got some very minor movements from the shoulder buttons, and you can center the camera behind you once again. However, neither of these options are useful in this situation. Free control of the camera would allow you to avoid these situations, but without it, you're blind way too often, resulting in hits that result in this annoying backtracking. Making matters worse is that there are 3 levels to this minigame. This is actually a big problem with the overall game. Many of the minigames ask you to play through them for multiple levels, but they just don't have the kind of gameplay that is conducive to being enjoyable after you've played them more than once. Finally, we came to treasure collecting. Again, self-explanatory title. You'll just run around and collect coins before a timer runs out. You have ample time to grab absolutely everything, and there's a handful of rounds to play through just like the previous minigame. Bizarrely, analog stick controls wouldn't work here. I played literally every other part of Studio Tour exclusively with analog controls, but for some reason they wouldn't work here. So I completed Angelica's world, and so far it's all very basic stuff. Search For Reptar wasn't exactly complex, but this feels even simpler. I had 11 keys on me after Angelica's minigames, so I headed to the locked door. Once you plug all of the keys in it, it opens, but reveals a second door that has 25 locks. The real kicker is that only one of the locks will open the door. To make things even spicier, the lock that opens the door is randomly determined. This explains why you get given so many keys, and also makes it possible to do super quick speedruns of the game if you get extremely lucky. You can literally beat the game in 30 minutes if you're good enough. We're reviewing Studio Tour, not trying to perfect pro speedrun strats though, so I moved on to Susie's world, which is titled Lazy Saddles. Goldmine kickstarted things and is actually one of the levels most ingrained in my memory. The babies jump into minecarts here and are tasked with collecting a certain amount of gold bars and then returning to the start before time expires. Along the way, the disturbing Mr. Friend will be zipping around too, so you have the ability to zap him with your flashlight if you get into trouble. Racing against the time limit is actually a lot harder than I remembered it, especially so when it's your first time exploring one of the levels. If you don't have a good knowledge of the layout, you're probably going to waste a fair amount of time. Additionally, getting hit by enemies makes you lose gold, requiring you to go out and collect even more. Because of the way this works, you could actually end up in a situation where there aren't enough gold bars left to meet the requirement, which I'm not a fan of. You'll also get hit by Mr. Friend when blindly turning around corners way too much. You have absolutely no control over this, so you basically just have to hope nobody's coming, or use your flashlight every single time you turn. Either way, it's not ideal. Roundup was next on the agenda, which is literally just picking up animals and putting them in their respective areas. There is a time limit, but it might as well not even exist, seeing how simple this is and how much time they give you. The one positive is that the final round sees you herding sheep as Spike. It's still not very good, but at least it's a unique twist on the gameplay, which is what is desperately needed if they're going to make you do these minigames multiple times. Lastly, we were taken to Milk Squirt, which I feel dirty for saying in a review about a game for children. That's the kind of title you see up on one of those naughty sites. Turns out Milk Squirt is just a target shooter. They changed this up a little as you progress through, so it's not just minutes and minutes of you shooting at targets, but it's still insanely simple. It's certainly no Toy Story Midway Mania. You also end up doing the exact same thing in Chuckie's world, so yeah, just like Search For Reptar, they were clearly strapped for minigame ideas. Just like that, we were halfway through the available worlds, and it was time to visit Chuckie in outside space. Zero G's was my first minigame here, and quite possibly was the first game that I truly enjoyed. You're basically playing a side-scrolling platformer here, sort of reminiscent of the first Crash Bandicoot. This change of pace immediately made me sit up, and to surprise me even more, it actually plays rather well. The platforming handles well enough, and while it's basic and bare bones like everything else in Studio Tour, there is a lot of potential here. I would play the heck out of an entire Rugrats game that played like this. My knowledge of Rugrats game really ends with Studio Tour, so I'm crossing my fingers for something that's sort of similar in the near future. The final game in Chuckie's world was Looney Lander, where the babies jump in spaceships and commit vehicular manslaughter by running down a bunch of aliens. If this looks a little familiar to you, it might be because in Dexter's Laboratory Manduck's lab there was a minigame with a very similar design and premise. Looney Lander manages to control a million times better, but the fun factor just isn't there. All you're doing is boringly driving around a level. Our final world is for both Phil and Lil, titled Diapers of Thunder. It's racing themed, which means every single level here is a kart race. This seems like an exciting prospect. Hell yeah, I want to see the very first time kart racing was included in a Nickelodeon game. Unfortunately, like when Manduck's Lab did the exact same thing, this kart racing is horrendous. The issue stems from the fact that, besides the babies being in karts, this is just the foot race minigame. Literally every issue present in that very first game is present in all of the races here. There's no sense of speed, items are still pretty useless, and catching up to other players is still impossibly hard if you fall behind. In my first race, I quite literally sat in second, trying desperately to catch up to first for like 5 straight laps, only to fall agonizingly short. I think the best representation of this mess is my lap times for the second time I did this first race. 6 out of the 8 laps I did were completed in 27 seconds. It just completely misses the point of what makes kart racing games fun. After I got my bearings, the final 2 races were so unbelievably dull. I just got out in front and then never saw another racer again because they couldn't possibly catch up unless I screwed up catastrophically. I got so bored here that I just started spamming the horn for fun. You can play some of the minigames in multiplayer, including these kart races, so maybe, and that's a very big maybe, it could be a little more fun with other humans. After finishing the final world, I found myself 2 keys short of the 25 key total. Technically, I didn't need that many, but knowing my luck, I was prepared to try every lock and have the last one be the one that opens the door. Thankfully, I wasn't that unlucky and managed to open the door successfully. The babies go charging after Dill, resulting in 3 more levels. We get an Angelica level straight up, where she's pretending to be Shirley Lock Holmes. Initially, you'll have to locate 4 keys before being taken to a small puzzle platforming section. Then, once that's done, it's time for Okie Dokie Jones. The gameplay here is similar to the 2D side-scrolling Chuckie section, but far more fleshed out. Weirdly though, the movement speed is all messed up. It's genuinely like Tommy did a huge line of cocaine before it. I can't understand why the movement speed is so quick. You literally never run this quickly anywhere else in the game, so it just comes off as bizarre. It also makes the platforming a lot harder than it usually would be. It's not easy to adjust to a coked out Tommy Pickles. I also had some problems with collision detection, particularly when it came to these moving pillars. If you touch them the wrong way, you'll be flung straight up into the air and to your death. Overall, this section is pretty tough. If they didn't mess with the movement speed, I would have loved it though. I really hope the future of Rugrats console games are a combination of these past 2 levels. The minigame stuff has been kind of neat, but it's certainly run its course. Shirley Lock Holmes and Okie Dokie Jones being the themes of these levels also feels like a direct homage to the movie, which featured the babies pretending to be both of those characters. Adding to that movie homage feeling is the game's finale, which sees Tommy and the crew being chased by Reptar while riding away in the Reptar wagon. This section kind of plays out like one of the chase levels in Crash Bandicoot. You know, the ones where a giant ball or dinosaur is chasing him down? It's a surprisingly hard finale to what is mostly a pushover of a game. It gives you difficulty whiplash when you go from putting animals in their correct pen to this. Once you've conquered the game, you're given 2 bonuses. The first is an extra racetrack in Diapers of Thunder, which is hardly enticing, while the second is a big head mode cheat code. It's pretty clear to me that Rugrats Search For Reptar was designed for very young kids. It's no surprise I was basically obsessed with this game as a kid. It's almost entirely focused on making it accessible for those who are new to gaming. I just don't think it has the same staying power as Search For Reptar. In that game you had the benefit of it being set in an iconic location from the show, and it was quaint seeing the characters in 3D and having all of the voice actors present. By the time Studio Tour rolls around, it's not as novel anymore. It does do a lot of things right and has plenty of nice little quirks. One of my favourites was the death animations. When a baby fails a platforming segment, it'll cut to them falling on a stunt mat, followed by a quip from a director. This is just such a cool way to show that the player failed, but not have the babies literally be dead. Although there was one weird glitch where Susie fell onto Angelica during this animation. Oh god, Angelica's been crushed to death on set. We're going to have to delay the release of the film out of respect. It's also pretty crazy to see just how much Mandark's Lab was inspired by this and Search For Reptar. Having revisited these 2 games now, it's clear that they set out to just make these games but with a Dexter skin. Not that I'm complaining. Presentation wise, it's a banger from N-Space again. Mark Mothersbaugh is back for the soundtrack and really gets to stretch his legs here with the different world themes. The whole of Chuckie's outer space section is a vibe. Visually, it's a minor step up from Search For Reptar in terms of fidelity. The real leap is made when you talk about scope. Environments are so much bigger, which is a natural progression from what they built in Search For Reptar. This is what happens when you give a developer a chance to build upon their work. Far too often we see development rights ping-pong around to different studios, resulting in a bunch of companies laying down foundations, but never really getting to build something truly great. While I've been very critical of the game, I'm glad N-Space were given a second crack at Rugrats.
Billy, stop, please! I want to go home!
I do like Rugrats Studio Tour, but I think a significant portion of that is tied up in my memories and nostalgia. Revisiting the minigames for the first time in years, they're honestly not the greatest, and in most cases, they're far too simple. However, as a game for young kids, it's hard to fault it. This was legitimately one of my favourite games as a kid, and compared to Search for Reptar, it feels like there's so much more going on here. I think whether you prefer this or Search for Reptar will really just come down to which one you played first. The formula has pretty much run its course by the end of either game's playtime, so booting up the second just feels a bit meh. Speaking of spiritual sequels, next time I'll be taking a look at Rugrats Time Travelers. This was developed by the same team behind the Rugrats movie, and is very much in the same sort of style. Will Time Travelers be a fantastic evolution, or will it just be more of the same?